Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to our series on sort of strategy and how we get to the World of Tanks. This is kind of a follow-up series. The previous installment, if you missed it, is basically on the evolution of armored warfare or armored doctrine. And so this time we're going to talk about the strategy of great powers. And I did do a previous talk that's very similar to this one at the Cantini player event that was specifically on grand strategy. This is a more general conversation about strategy in general because it's a big topic and grand strategy is just one component of all of that. So let me go ahead and start here. First of all, I usually give this because I'm kind of delivering this as a more academic talk. So this is a little bit more of my background because this is usually standard. You've probably already seen this if you've watched the others in the series, but basically I got my undergraduate. I did my undergraduate work at UCLA in international relations and political theory, and then I also got my PhD and master's along the way in international relations. And my focus was on international security studies and on international political economy over at USC. And then I've done a lot of different work. I worked on edutainment for a couple of years. And then I switched over and I did a bunch of work for consoles and PC, but that also included some milsim work for the U.S. Army, specifically from around 2003. And then I started wargaming in 2013. So although I don't really claim to be a military expert, I did touch a bunch of military simulators, including Elect Bilat, JFITS, and as part of the Call for Fire Trainers, Urban Sim, and C3ITD. And those are all sort of programs that are used for training. And as a consequence of all that, I actually did do additional consulting work for the military on some of the training programs and the future of simulations and training and stuff like that. So I have some exposure to this stuff, but I don't claim to be an expert. So basically, Rybot approached me and said, hey, you know, the Cantini talk went pretty well. People were interested in the topic, but it's a huge topic. Can you break this down and perhaps do a few more segments on this? So the first segment I did was on armored doctrine, and this time it's going to be in the strategy of the great powers. I'm toying around with the idea of doing something on logistics and trading, but as a standalone topic, those are a little bit dry, so maybe we'll figure some other way to incorporate those into either consolidate them or make them part of some other talk. So just keep that in mind. But definitely, strategy of the great powers is plenty to talk about. So without further ado, I always give a little bit of a review here because I use some terms, and not everyone uses this distinction, but I do. Usually when we talk about grand strategy, what we're talking about is the direction of all the resources of a nation and sort of the broad direction in which a country conducts its foreign policy. Then you have operations, and that's much more in the realm of the generals, and this is what the military forces are employed, and sort of their priority and sort of where are they employed. Tactics to me is much more like how they're employed. Once you're actually on the battlefield, where is the placement of all your units? You know, how do you use them? You know, do you do a flanking attack? Do you do a pinning attack? You know, what are you trying to accomplish on the battlefield? In some military parlance, that's like also considered fieldcraft, which is the actual employment of the weapon systems on the ground. And again, there's sort of an implied hierarchy here, but that hierarchy is only in terms of scale. I think that the important decisions are made in all of these levels, and as we'll talk about in terms of strategy, particularly pertaining to World War II, how actually decisions at these different levels are very, very critical, and how that represented sort of a revolution in how military thinking happens. And actually, it's a dialogue that's being carried through even to today. I just heard a talk from General Brown, who's, I guess, head of the U.S. Army in Pacific Rim, and he was saying some of the same things that you're going to hear here, so I know that this is stuff that's still been talked about. The final one is Doctrine, and Doctrine's kind of an unusual thing because Doctrine is sort of the theory and practice off the battlefield, but it definitely has battlefield ramifications. And you'll hear me say this, but basically what it is that an entire army does not experience a battle. Only a part of the army experiences a battle. But if lessons are to be learned from that battle, the best thing to do is to take those knowledge gained, usually at the cost of, at a very high cost, and for successes and failures, is to collect that data and then disseminate it to the rest of your armed forces, and that's where Doctrine plays in. And Doctrine is also speculation. Doctrine also determines what forces, in peacetime or between conflicts, what emphasis is placed on weapons procurement, and how do we envision fighting in the future? And that's kind of how decisions are made about equipment procurement and everything else. If you think about the fact that a battleship or something like that takes years to build, and with modern weapon systems, tanks, airplanes, they take decades to develop. When weapon systems take that long, you have to have some idea of how they'll be employed, and that's kind of the role that Doctrine plays. So when we talk about the strategy of great powers, again, this is a complex topic, and I don't pretend that I'm going to cover everything, but I'm just going to try to give an overview of all of it. And there are a lot of different components and facets of basically strategy. And when we talk about strategy to great powers, I want to clarify that I'm specifically talking about World War II, and that sort of in the context of mid-century, the decision-making during World War II that really affected how we think about the conflict, and also how combat was conducted and how that had real impact on armored conflict, right? Especially warfare, tank-on-tank warfare, tank versus infantry warfare, all these kind of implications. First of all, I'm going to start off by kind of delving into academia a little bit here, so you'll have to forgive me. But there's sort of a notion that there's two ways to kind of approach all of this. There's sort of the historical approach, which I think most people probably watching this or playing our game are more familiar with. And the reason why sometimes I sound a little bit different than other YouTubers or even people who are into this stuff is because I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Next thing to talk about is sort of strategy and what strategy is and what it isn't or what it can't do. And then we'll go back to the topic of grand strategy and get an overview of how things work. And then once we have an idea what our grand strategy is or what the grand strategy approach was from all of the great powers, then we can start looking at some of the more specific details. Because again, having a broad strategy doesn't necessarily dictate how things will unfold kind of from a practical sense, that there are more detailed levels that we need to look at. And so below grand strategy, we have things like what is the diplomatic strategy? What is the industrial strategy? What is the technological strategy? And then we can think of things then we can actually look, and those are usually considered at the level of the nation or the national level. But then once we get down to sort of the actual military, what are some of the different kind of strategic concerns that we have? Force composition, logistics, training, and again, we'll come back to the whole topic of doctrine. Okay, so first of all, and I had to throw in that picture somewhere just because I had such a smile on my face. But one thing that I want to cover is what is theoretical versus historical analysis. And most people approach World War II from a historical perspective, which is great. I mean, that's fine. You've heard me say this before. I almost went down the history road, and instead I went down the international relations road. So I'll explain the difference between the two, because from the outside they look very, very similar, but there's a fundamental difference between the two, which explains a slight difference in my approach and attitude to some of these things. History, the joke is history is one damn thing after another, but that's actually what the approach is of historical analysis. Historical analysis delves into the actual, when, let's say you're studying something like a conflict like World War II, you look at the actual events and what happened, who did what, who said what, and you collect all of that information and you build a story based on that information. You're looking for a very specific and discrete set of events, and you're using that to describe what happened. I love history. I absolutely adore history. And I will tell you that the contrasting view, which is international relations, and it's not really contrasting, it's just a different approach, can't exist without history. History is the basis by which all of this is done. However, I was an international relations scholar, and there's a slight difference there, and that's primarily in the way that things are used. History is used to describe events that have already happened. International relations is kind of a weird offset of this, in the sense that the two places that international relations are often used is either to predict things in the future or predict conflicts in the future, or conversely, to explain things as they are happening to decision makers who then have to make decisions. So because of that, international relations has to kind of approach things a little bit differently. Instead of looking at a specific sequence of events and kind of cataloging those events, we kind of look for systems. And we look for systems that explain why things happened. And the reason why we need to be more abstract about that is that we need to possibly apply these things to things that haven't happened yet, may never happen, or are in the middle of happening, which is kind of a confusing way to put it. But history always has that advantage of it can be very, very precise because it's looking at events that have already happened. So that's kind of why I take a much more theoretical approach to a lot of this stuff. I love history, and I think the historical approach is the proper approach specifically for topics like World War II, but I do have a slightly different spin on things, and that's probably why I don't necessarily sound like some of the other people who talk about World War II or talk about history and everything else, because I'm trying to always look for systems. And I'm stating this because this is more of a bias than saying that it's better or worse. It's just that I've noticed whenever I do these presentations that it just comes forward, and I realize that there was no explanation of that, because if you just look at my CV page that I had prior, that doesn't really explain anything. And so that's kind of why I'm explaining the difference between historical and sort of a theoretical international relations approach. Okay, well, all of that aside, that's really not why we're here. So let's talk about strategy. So basically, if we think about strategy, strategy is how do we employ the resources of our nation to accomplish our goals? And a lot of these goals are very, very basic. We think of them as sort of almost, we can use a biological analog, right? Is that one of the main purposes of security and defense and all these other things is a preservation of self, right? And as a human being, that's one thing that we engage in all the time. We eat, we sleep, we have all of these elements of our daily existence are so that we're there the next day. And that's sort of the idea, and that's one of the primary goals of strategy, is a preservation of the state. Now, we can also apply these to sub-state actors and everything else, but I don't want to get too in the weeds on all those details. But so basically, we're talking about nations right now. And one of the things that you'll notice with strategy, and sometimes I'll say, oh, they're very reactive or things like that, is because strategy cannot exist in the vacuum of the real world. You have to look at what is available to you at that moment, what resources you have, what capabilities you have, and how can you most creatively apply them to get your desired outcome. That does not mean that you have enough resources to get that desired outcome. That does not mean that getting those desired outcomes is in any way inevitable. And that's kind of why conflicts happen, is that multiple sides will have conflicting goals, and that will cause them to clash. Maybe it was inevitable that one side would lose. It's hard to say, but both sides are going to do their best. They're going to find strategies that best fit what their capabilities are. But because of that, strategy cannot necessarily make up for a lack of capacity. So that's something that takes in mind. Good strategies look at what capacity you have and then form a plan based on that capacity to get the best possible outcome. So I guess the reason why I emphasize this is that if you talk about strategy in a vacuum, what was the optimal move? What were the optimal moves? we can play that as an academic game. We can kind of play that as a counterfactual game. But the reality is strategy is limited by the resources at hand. So in other words, no matter how good the strategy is, there's no guarantee of victory, right? It's a combination of what is your goals, what are your resources, and how you execute your plan to get to those goals, okay? I'm being super vague, I know, but specifically this is applying to war, but I'm trying to kind of get from this from a theoretical or conceptual point of view. All right. So we've talked about it before, but again, for the purposes of this specific talk, let's talk about grand strategy. And grand strategy is really the direction of a country's entire resources towards the pursuit of a goal. And this is a very broad kind of goal. And one of the things that we have to keep in mind is that, and this is where the international relations stuff is creeping in, is that all nations live in an anarchic world. You can argue that during World War II, there was a League of Nations, or in the modern world, we have the United Nations. Those things are sort of collective bodies, but there is no, although that they have, quote unquote, we've given them jurisdiction over things like international court of law and things like that, no nation is bound by that the way a citizen is bound to the laws of their country, if that makes sense. The countries that belong to the United Nations are not the same things as citizens of the United States, right? That relationship is very, very different. As a citizen of the United States, I have obligations and then I have protections from the state, and that there is a mutual relationship there. With nations, that's definitely not the case. And so every nation must be responsible for their own survival. And because of that, conflicts happen. And because of that, all nations must have some kind of grand strategy in terms of how they will face their adversaries, or what their goals are and how they will pursue them. And in World War II, this becomes very, very critical, right? So if we think about grand strategy, or what were the goals for for the major powers in World War II, I think, and again, I think that there's definitely room for argument and debate, which I really welcome. But I would argue that for the Axis powers, primarily this was a case of expansion of territory. Germany, in particular, as the loser of World War I, was under very, very restricted terms under the Treaty of Versailles. And at the height of the age of imperialism, it found itself pretty much blocked out from external colonies and blocked off from resources. It was also a late industrializer, meaning that it industrialized basically based on chemicals and sort of second wave industrialization, as opposed to first wave industrializers like the United Kingdom, which is on textiles. Because of that, resources and territory were absolutely critical. These were the things that fed modern industrialization. Japan was in a different situation. Japan was actually, one of the victors of World War I, but it also found itself in a position where it was at the losing end of a resource war. Japan itself is pretty devoid of natural resources, and the European powers had largely carved up Asia as a source of resources, and Japan was cut out of that. The same can also applies to Italy. Italy was a slightly different case in that Italy was divided until much later than Germany. We have to remember that Germany didn't really unify until 1870, and then Italy was much later. And so both of these countries were, again, sort of latecomers to the imperial game and were cut out from external expansion. You can see that their actions sort of match this. Germany was obviously interested in territorial expansion. Japan was interested in territorial expansion. It had already kind of dabbled in imperialism when it grabbed Korea, and then it started moving in on China, which was largely divided by warlords at the time, and started making political moves first through Manchuria and through the rest of China. And Italy, of course, with its expansion into North Africa and Ethiopia. So definitely it kind of matches that their goals were the expansion of territory. And Germany, to a certain degree, was also to try to throw off the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles and things that it felt were unfair. Now, the Soviet Union was in a different state. They had gone through, after their civil war, basically, 22 nations were involved in the Soviet Civil War. So, of course, they were extremely paranoid about foreign intervention. And because of that, they were very much concerned with the expansion of their borders, at least as a safety zone. And definitely the strategy that they took is that securing the core part of the country was critical and that sort of the periphery would have to give way in favor of the core. And that was sort of their kind of strategic goal. And UK and France, I think before the war, their primary concern was preservation of the status quo. And I think because of that, this kind of reflected in sort of the strategy they took in terms of appeasement and everything else. And what they were hoping is by making small concessions, incrementally, that the problems would go away. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way, but I think that was their primary goal. And the United States, I think, was completely, I won't say disassociated entirely from European politics, but it was largely isolationist and primarily concerned with economic prosperity. And so it really didn't have a deep strategic goal, at least in Europe. I think in the Pacific, it did have a little bit more of an aggressive stance, but definitely sort of in terms of European politics, I think that they were a lot more disassociated from all that. So those are sort of the goals, and that sort of sets the context. But how they go about getting to these goals is a different matter. And so this is sort of like what we think of as the ways and means. I think Germany has always been in this case, because after World War I, although it had already planned for this and knew that this was always going to be a problem, the problem that Germany always faces being in Central Europe is the fact that they're going to have to, at some point, face enemies on two sides. So all of their strategy, back to World War I and even before World War I, was how they can fight warfare very efficiently, how they could be very efficient at conflict. So this is everything from the Schlieffen Plan to, the idea of how blitzkrieg, all of these other things that we think of and associate with sort of German strategy was the idea of efficient warfare. Japan, being primarily a naval power, was actually trying to reconcile two different strategies. And you can see that the Imperial Japanese Navy was very much divided along these lines. It was the idea of decisive battle or attritional warfare. And this was from a Navy point of view, not necessarily a ground army strategy, but definitely a Navy strategy. And that you had the idea that either there will be a single massive battle, having sort of learned from World War I and the Battle of Jutland, where you try to have a massive naval battle that forces one side or the other to capitulate because so many of their capital ships will have been destroyed, or attritional warfare. And so this was sort of like the destroyers and sort of a night mission strategy of wear down the enemy as they move further and further, as their logistic train becomes longer and longer. Italy was primarily concerned with expansionism, and I wouldn't say that they necessarily had a strong strategic doctrine, but I think that they were looking for targets of opportunity where they could expand their empire, which is why they sort of engaged in conflict in North Africa. The Soviet Union was definitely used what had served them in the past as sort of their ways and means, which was to trade land for time. It had worked in the past. I think the classic example everyone always talks about is the Napoleon's invasion, but the whole idea that the vastness of the countryside was their greatest ally, and so was weather, and that both of these things would ultimately work in their favor. So that's why they needed large buffers so that they could defend in depth. The United Kingdom, I think, took the strategy that the ocean is our shield, and I think that also served them very, very well. They focused resources on the RAF and on the Navy, and they made sure that their Navy was basically feared, and that at best, like one of their best strategies was to force other navies to never leave port. And so that's kind of an interesting strategy, and I think it worked very well for them. We talk about Sea Lion. We even have a war story about Sea Lion. I think the idea that Germany would be able to mount a credible amphibious attack against England was very, very tough. Although I think that the possibility of a blockade and kind of driving Britain to economic ruin was distinctly possible. And so the air war might have played out differently, but again, those are sort of speculation. But I think that using the idea that they were an island and that was actually in their favor, I think served them well. France, I think, learned a little bit too much from World War I and kind of relied on the idea of trading time for land. And I think that ended up not really working in their favor. The idea that we were still living in a defensive era had sort of been eclipsed. And if you go back to the discussion that I had about armored warfare and armored doctrine, about how there was an evolution at the end of World War I from kind of static trench warfare to infiltration tactics, and how that kind of evolved into, in World War II, what we would consider to be squad tactics, that this was something that technology had sort of gone past, and it might not have been the right sort of strategic choice. The United States, once it entered the war, had basically two broad approaches. One is that it would be the arsenal of democracy. What was the United States particularly good at? Its industrial might. And so what it would do, it would build things for the rest. It would build things for the rest of its allies. It would build plenty of tanks, it would build plenty of aircraft, and it would send this overseas. Now, definitely we also sent troops, we also sent our expertise, but a lot of this was basically to become the arsenal of democracy. The other critical strategy, and this is one where you can definitely see this, is the idea to focus on Europe first. That because the conflict with Japan, and a lot of people debate why this was the case. I think it's pretty obvious, but there are multiple factors. One, I think, is that it was possible to engage in Europe more quickly. And second of all, the conflict with Japan was primarily a naval one. And, like we were talking about earlier, warships take a long time to build. That is not something that you can immediately, on the turn of a dime, go to war. Now, the United States already had a large Navy, but it knew it needed to build up its naval capacity. It also had to sort of rebuild after the losses at Pearl Harbor. Luckily, the carriers weren't gone, but still, there was a rebuilding process to kind of rebuild the core fleet and rebuild all the logistics networks and everything else, so that it makes sense to approach the conflict looking at Europe first. Now, part of all of this is a diplomatic strategy, and I think that if you are a diplomatic historian, you sometimes neglect the military side, and if you're a military historian, you sometimes neglect the diplomatic side. But diplomacy is definitely an integral part of any national strategy, and there are a lot of different ways that diplomacy can play into this, and this is why sometimes diplomacy is very how should I put it, two-faced, in the sense that because it's usually trying to accomplish some of these goals, and these goals are not necessarily always your stated goals, right? But the primary function of a diplomatic strategy are things like building alliances, and the critical reason for building alliances is, of course, you're seeking military and geographic advantage. And if you think about the vast quantities of resources involved, the manpower required to fight a war, especially an industrial war, and even just physical geography, all these factors play into looking at alliances. Countries were drawn into this conflict and became important allies because of their physical location, or because of geographic features, or because of what industrial capacity they could bring to a fight. These are all factors that are important in terms of building alliances. It's like, yes, in many cases, maybe you could fight alone, but isn't it easier to fight with allies? Even given all of the problems of coordination and the fact that the two nations who are allies may not necessarily have the same goals, right? The next thing you can do with diplomacy is to create doubt. Is that by political maneuvering, you can actually confuse and obscure your intent. And I think we saw Germany do this a lot. This was sort of the idea that you tell people you're doing one thing while you're doing another. It's hard for them to understand or assess what direction you're taking until maybe it's too late. That's at least the goal that you'll see often. The third one is public opinion. And sometimes we kind of say, well, how important really is public opinion in warfare or things like that? But it actually can play a huge effect. Domestic politics, I think, particularly in the age of democracies, domestic politics is very, very vital. But I think even when you're not talking about democracies, domestic politics are extremely important. For instance, a lot of times they talk about the Battle of France and how quickly it wrapped up. But really, you also have to keep in mind that there was multiple internal political struggles going on in France at the time. You had the rise of the Popular Front movement. There were all kinds of things that were happening in France, and it were being affected by diplomacy from the outside, and that had an effect on how things in terms of national outcome, and and these factors all play into sort of why one would take a diplomatic strategy. And I don't want to go into that because that could be a talk in and of itself, but that's sort of the role that diplomatic strategy plays. Industrial strategy is also kind of a tricky one because it's not glamorous, not necessarily fun to talk about, but probably one of the most critical things when you're talking about an industrial war. And that's sort of like, what strategy do you take in terms of the production of your arms and in terms of arming your country? Germany definitely took the path of technological superiority, taking advantage of the fact that it actually had a lot of, it was a leader in science, it was a leader in philosophy, it was a leader in a lot of areas, intellectual areas. So it wanted to capitalize on that. And also it was a late industrializer, and it wanted to capitalize on its advantages there. And so they were looking for technological superiority wherever they could. The other interesting thing that they did is that they actually resisted going to a wartime economy, which is a little bit difficult for us to grasp considering how the war eventually turned out. But initially, Germany actually resisted going to a wartime economy. And many would argue that they switched to a wartime economy too late. And by the time that they had to decide, they were so fearful of disrupting the civilian economy that they avoided going into a wartime economy. And this had a disastrous effect on sort of their military production capability. Japan was kind of behind in the industrial race, and they very much needed natural resources because they produced so little natural resources on their own, and they were very much focused on colonial extraction. And the unpleasantness of all of this is that it's not just resources but also labor. I think that this was sort of the strategy they took. It was not enough, and it did not compensate for the fact that they did not have enough industrial capacity to face the enemies that they had sort of picked the fight with. And that kind of relates back to the idea of why half of the Imperial Japanese, why the two sort of threads in the Imperial Japanese Navy were either go for one large decisive battle and hopefully everyone will sue for peace, or to go for attritional warfare. And that alone could probably be a whole talk, but you get the idea here that their industrial strategy was based on sort of this idea that that's why the colonies were necessary. And I think that, of course, had very, very poor effect. Italy took the approach of autarky, and autarky is sort of the idea of self-sufficiency, of self-reliance. I think that the globalization of the modern economy has kind of proven that approach doesn't really work. The problem is usually that when you try to be a master of everything, you end up being a master of none. And by closing off your borders and trying to do everything yourselves, you introduce a lot of failure points in your economy. You have to be a very, very large economy to be able to pull it off. And I think Italy's approach, and I think this was largely philosophically driven by the fascists, and Mussolini, was just not a viable strategy, but it is a strategy they took. The Soviet Union took did sort of a different industrial strategy. They did have a big industrial base, and of course there's a whole miracle of moving their entire industrial base, east of the Urals to protect it from German invasion. That alone is a huge, I mean, that you could say was their industrial strategy, but they also sort of took this approach of build the minimum needed. How long is a tank expected to last on the battlefield? Don't worry about maintenance that kicks in hour, in hour 100 or hour 1000 if you think that it's only going to last in the 2 or 3 days on the battlefield. Focus on that, produce the bare minimum, and produce as much as we can. And that was sort of the Soviet strategy, and I think that it worked really well. They produced more T-34s than Shermans were produced, right? And this was despite the fact that they had to move their factories and that they were fighting a war on their own soil. They were able to produce so many tanks. So that's sort of definitely you could see the advantage of that strategy. The United States, on the other hand, sort of the opposite case, had the advantage of not having the home guard threatened at all. So the United States kind of took the approach that, that was sort of pioneered by American car makers and everything else, and focused on standardization and streamlined productions. A lot of times people say, well, when the Sherman was released, it was a really, really awesome tank, but as the war went on, then we didn't really upgrade it. Well, some of the other sides of the conflict, particularly Germany, were kept going through revisions. You do have to keep in mind, though, that when we're talking about this war, we're talking about from start to finish, maybe a 4 to 5 year period, depending when you want to start it for Asia or for Europe. But you're still talking about a fairly short period of time, and you're talking about industrial policies that involve the constructions of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of vehicles. And so the American strategy was do not focus on standardization, focus on everybody kind of optimizing their production chain and produce as much as you can. So again, though, while maybe there weren't quite as many Shermans as there were T-34s, there was a lot of them. And the United States, on top of that, was also building aircraft. We were building fighters. We were building warships. We were building strategic bombers. We were doing a nuclear atomic development program. All of these things were happening concurrently, and that was vast sums of money spent. And to do that, the entire system had to be very rationalized, and the entire system had to be very streamlined. And that's sort of the industrial strategy that the Americans took. France and the United Kingdom were largely reactive. I think this was a consequence of them being in the military situation they were so early in the war that basically they did what they could, and I don't think that there was one industrial strategy, but they definitely did what they could with what resources they had. So I would say that that's one where they're just reacting, and that's far more tactical than, let's say, a general strategic plan. Now, on top of all this, I think we can look at the technological strategy, and this is a little bit different from the industrial strategy, because this is sort of like what secondary technologies are you also developing, and where are you putting the emphasis of your research? I think clearly from the way that we look at German tanks, their emphasis was on tactical weapon systems. If we think of a lot of the game changers in terms of mid-20th century military technology, a lot of it was sort of either a reaction to, either from German sort of designs or a reaction to German designs. Things like the three-man turret, although I guess, that's not necessarily the biggest example, but like there were a lot of innovations that were coming out of sort of the work that they're doing, and they were focusing largely on tactical weapons systems. Everything from the Sturmgewehr F-44 to the Panther tank. The example I always love to use is that the Tiger P or the Tiger Porsche was going to have a hybrid electric drive, and then it was going to be entirely electric motor driven. And we're talking about a tank that was, in the mid-40s. That's pretty amazing, right? Japan focused on naval tactical weapon systems, and they had a couple advantages. I think, people forget, but like if you played World of Warships, you know that those long lance torpedoes are awesome because they have such amazing range. And I think that early on, Japan had some of these tactical weapon systems advantages, particularly on the naval side. They had very good naval aircraft, their fighters and bombers, and they had really good torpedoes. They were lacking in other areas, like in terms of electronics. Their radars and radios were not up to snuff, and definitely cryptography, they weren't there. But in terms of sort of the tactical naval weapon systems, that's where most of their research went to. The Soviet Union, I think, was also forced because of Germany's invasion to focus on tactical land weapon systems, and they did that very, very well. Things like the T-34 tank and their ground systems and lots of artillery. I think we forget the fact that the Soviets really were the masters of artillery, and they had a lot of it, and they built it in large numbers, and it was very reliable, and there was a lot of it. And things like the Katyusha and things like that, like a little bit less accurate, but in sufficient numbers, it can have devastating effect. The United Kingdom, again, I think that they were forced into a much more reactive state, but that didn't knock them out of the technology game. Their focus definitely was intelligence. Fixation is usually on the radar, which is definitely true, but I would also consider that to be an intelligence device, right? It allows you to do more with less. Germans were convinced that the RAF had way more fighters than they thought they had, simply because they were pushing radar and using radar so that what normally would require scrambling from very close in range, once you have a spotter spotting something with radar, because you can spot things further out, you can intercept from further away, and that allowed them to manage the Battle of Britain very, very well. But on top of all that, and I think one of the greater coups was the concentration on intelligence and cryptography. Bletchley Park, I still haven't gone there. That's a place I definitely want to go. Sort of the heart of British cryptography and breaking encryption. All of the work that was done in terms of building electronic computers, cracking Enigma, cracking all of these codes, that was an incredible amount of effort and work that was put into that. And I think that's where the British kind of put a lot of their technological prowess into. The United States, again, had sort of the bankroll to invest in everything. So, I do want to, but I think that there are certain things where the United States really, so I could actually say that the United States did all of the above, but I think in fairness, there are certain areas where they particularly focused on and where that advantage was very, very clear. Logistics is the first one, and logistics is the most unsexy thing to talk about. And yet you hear the term, amateurs talk about tactics, professionals talk about logistics. United States definitely, logistics is probably one of our primary concerns. When you talk about the industrial might of the United States, often there's a fixation on how many tanks did you build? How many fighters did you build? One of the greatest assets that the United States produced was trucks. The sheer number of trucks that the United States produced. It produced enough for the entire United States military, and then it also produced enough for Lend-Lease for both the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. And the fact, the truth is, truck transport doesn't sound very sexy, but it's absolutely important. The modern division, if I don't get to do the logistics thing, I will say that the amount of tonnage of supplies that a single division needs in a single day in just maintenance and not even in offensive operations is a huge amount of supplies. Multiply that by the numbers of divisions that are in the front. Multiply that by the number of trucks it requires to transport this. Keep in mind that a lot of the logistics that were being done were still being done by horse-drawn carriage. So to replace a horse-drawn carriage, which can only do a few trips a day, with a truck that can be run day and night, that is a huge technological advantage. The United States also put a lot of money into electronics. So not only were we doing decryption with electric computers and mechanical computers, but we were also building good radars, good radios, and we had a lot of them. And their distribution gave us a huge sort of intelligence and C3I, or command control and command and control advantage. And then there's also the strategic weapon systems, obviously the biggest one being the development of the atom bomb, although also the development of long-range bomber technology and all of these other things that were very, very critical to sort of at the strategic level and strategic weapons. And again, I think Italy and France were largely reactive in this respect. So What about specific military strategy? And this gets a little bit closer to what we're getting at in terms of armored conflict and sort of World War II, right? So Germany, definitely their big innovation and their big strategy was independent armor formations. This is the start of the war. Obviously, by the end of the war, everyone kind of adopted that. But that was their sort of early advantage. France and the United Kingdom had taken integrated armor formations, which sort of from a theoretical point of view made a lot of sense. The idea that you were supporting infantry, so your armor should be everywhere so that they can help everywhere. The one problem with that is when your enemy concentrates their armor, you're not well placed to counter that. So in other words, even though if the French tanks at the start of the war were really, really hard for the German tanks to kill, especially when you're talking about Panzer IIs and Panzer Is, maybe a handful of Panzer IIIs and IVs against something like a Char 1 Biz. That's actually a really tough fight. However, if the numbers are such, or if the circumstances are such where you can either bypass the tank or hit it from behind or destroy its supply train, or the fact that you're outnumbered 3-1 or 5-1 or 10-1 makes that kind of irrelevant. So that difference in strategy definitely had an effect. The U.S. also took a different approach too, and again, I think guys like the chieftain are have a lot more to say on this. But the idea of having tank destroyers as sort of a formation as being the anti-armor formation, and having your tank formations as being the breakthrough formations. Logistics, as I said again, and I guess I kind of preempted myself here. Trucks, trucks, and trucks. Right, the U.S. had basically motorized their whole supply system. I think, because of Hollywood and movies, we kind of think that everything was driven around by trucks by all sides. Really, that wasn't the case, right? I think when I want to say it was Band of Brothers or one of these movies, when they actually showed the Germans transporting supplies via a horse-drawn carriage, I was like, wow, wait, someone actually portrayed that. Because like even when you read some of the memoirs of some of the German generals after World War II, one guy said that I joined the military because they had this notion that everything was motorized and everything was mechanized, and the first duty that I had was taking care of the horses in the stables because we were still using them to tow artillery. So the fact that basically taking the strategy of motorizing your logistics is a huge advantage, because now you can move a large number of supplies over a large distance very, very quickly. What's the downside of that? Not only now do you have to transport all of the fuel and everything else for your fighting units, now you have to keep those trucks supplied as well. Now keep this in mind, how seriously Americans took logistics is that there's a movie about truck drivers during World War I. And so I suggest you look that up, because that's how serious a topic it is. And that's how big a deal it was, transporting large supplies, especially right after the Normandy invasion. Again, Germany, Italy, and Japan largely was horse-drawn supply system. And of course, everyone used rail. So it's not like it was entirely horse-drawn. And I should say that everybody did have trucks. It was just a question of how often or how much of the supplies were sort of transported by trucks. And I would argue that the United States was clearly in the lead in this respect. The other interesting thing is that because the United States was able to produce so many trucks, they were able to produce trucks for the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. So both of our allies were also able to use trucks, and also more, and perhaps as important or more importantly, were able to divert their industrial resources towards production of fighting vehicles, not worrying about also producing trucks on top of all that. So believe it or not, like I said, we could probably spend an entire session talking about logistics, but even for me, that's a little dry. So we'll see about that topic. And the final thing is sort of a strategy towards training. And again, I think we always have the advantage of hindsight. I think the two countries that took training the most seriously was the United States and Germany, to good effect. Again, when I talked about Germany and infiltration tactics in the previous session, that required training your leadership down to the lieutenant level, down to the platoon and squad levels, where they had to have competent leaders, and that required a lot of training and establishing good training pipelines. The United States was concerned with building a cadre of pilots, for instance, for its fighter program and its naval aviation. And when it did so, it did it in depth to make sure that there were always new pilots available that were highly trained. To give you an idea of how that can be detrimental, is Japan could never build a good educational system to train replacement pilots, as they had very, very experienced pilots, and initially they had actually pretty good aircraft as well, until sort of the American technology not only caught up but blew past it. But a lot of their early air victories were the fact that they had these very experienced pilots that had already been engaged in China. But as those pilots were lost or injured, they were not able to replace them with the same kind of training infrastructure the United States had. And ultimately, that meant that the United States built up a larger and larger and larger force of well-trained basically of airmen. And that was something that they did not have on the Japan side. They did not have the depth of their training facilities. And that had a tremendous effect later on. And I think also we can see that that's like the level of training indicates how far down you can push authority. And that's why, for instance, some argue that the Soviet system was a little bit inflexible, is that they did not have as much time to train individual, lower level officers and soldiers, because they were in such basically a knife fight, right? That they didn't really have time to train a lot of their soldiers. So that's why their tactics had to be a little bit heavy-handed from top down. It's just that there was no time to train their soldiers to act more independently. And so this is kind of, all of these factors matter. And there's also the factor of experience too, and how do you take experience and apply that back? Lessons learned on the battlefield, how do you then take that information and proliferate it back to the troops that were not involved in that fight? And one thing that, so I don't have personal experience, but every time I read things about it, is the exposure to combat, the first time a unit is in combat, has a tremendous effect on their latter performance. And there has to be this trial by fire. And that requires a lot of logistics and planning to make sure that it's not just the same units that are always engaged in the fight, but that you make sure that your units are exposed, that all of your units are exposed to combat. And this leads us to Doctrine, which is sort of the last place that we go with all of this. And everyone had a different approach. Germany, again, I've talked about this before, so I won't go too in depth into it, had the concept of Schwerpunkt. But the thing about Schwerpunkt is that by giving a unified goal that's being approached by all levels of command, what that means is a high level of training and a high level of initiative needed by your low-level officers. The U.S. doctrine, I think, was primarily that of the primacy of support. So we relied heavily on calling in air power and calling in artillery. And I think that is, and reactive artillery fire, which will converse to the Soviet version, which I'll get to in a second. But that our doctrine was very much, we advance to contact, we find the enemy, and then we try to destroy them as much as possible without direct fighting to reduce our casualties. And I think that's sort of the approach and sort of the doctrine that we took. The Soviet Union was to mass firepower, and again, they had some inflexibility because they couldn't necessarily train all of their officers down to the sort of like at the squad or platoon level as much as other countries had the luxury of. It's not that they weren't getting experience, but that also meant that because it was so uneven, that a lot of times their command structure was a little bit heavy-handed. So what they often relied on was pre-planned things, so like massive artillery barrages before an attack. And this is sort of contrast to the American side of reacting to something and then calling in airstrikes. Japan did have some tactics, although I think that typically they're characterized as banzai charge and not necessarily a whole lot of tactics. But I actually did find an American doctrine Again, this is like training people who hadn't fought against the Japanese how to fight against the Japanese. I actually found a document when I was researching for this, and they talk about actually one of the things that you have to be very careful of is that Japan was very much in this concept of envelopment, and that they did have command was sufficiently dispersed that as soon as there's a contact, be aware that the other forces would actually break contact to try to surround and envelop whatever they were attacking. And that this was something that the early units that had fought against the Japanese had discovered, and then that was being shared through documentation. Anyway, again, this is kind of like, this is a complex topic, and there's a lot to cover, and I do appreciate people who showed interest in all of this. And again, if there are other topics you're interested in, if there's other things that you'd like to see us talk about, please let us know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching.